When I found out that they were, and Shamrock at the time was already there, and as UFC fans will recall, Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock had 2 fights in the UFC on pay-per-view before John McCain stuck his nose in and got the UFC kicked off pay-per-view for a while. And they had 2 fights, and one won one and one won the other, and they never had the third fight. And then I found out that Dan obviously was doing some pro wrestling, and he was available, and they were going to bring him into the WWF. He was the NWA World Champion at the time. So I sat down because I knew Dan personally. He had worked for me. I'd watched his matches. I knew there were a number of things that he couldn't do, and there were also a number of things that he could do better than anybody else we had. And I knew that we had Ken Shamrock in the same company in that rubber match. You think at the time when WWF was not doing the best business it's ever done, that these 2 guys that had drawn in the hundreds of thousands of pay-per-view buys with no television, what could they do with TV behind them? So I sat down one night of my own volition. This was after I was already off the creative team, as I recall. And I wrote down, handwritten, 12 to 15 pages of notes on here's what Dan Severn can do in pro wrestling, and here's what he can't do. Here's how he should be portrayed, and here's how he shouldn't be portrayed. Here's how you accentuate his strengths, and here's how you hide his weaknesses. And I sent it off to Vince McMahon. The problem was the moron writing the television at the time was a complete jock-sniffing idiot who, if he'd been caught in the men's locker room, would have been whistling Stranger in Paradise, who had no idea about any realism or credibility in combat sports, wasn't a pro wrestling fan or a UFC fan or a boxing fan. He liked baseball, but he liked sports entertainment. He liked people that were painted different colors, and he liked dressing men as women and women as men and doing comedy skits. And I know you'll never guess what his name was, but he was a big piece of shit. And
that doesn't narrow it down, because coming from you,
okay.
I mean...
Well, it was Vince Russo. And basically, since Vince McMahon had never seen Dan Severn or the UFC or anybody else's professional wrestling, and I guess didn't bother to read the notes, Russo would rather use people that were painted different colors and comedy figures and fucking wearing stupid clothing and do, a bunch of shit off the Jerry Springer show than take a guy who was the most decorated amateur athlete that the United States has ever produced, with over 100 national, regional, and local wrestling and grappling championships, a UFC Hall of Famer, a Triple Crown winner, a super fight winner, former UFC champion, and who maintained a high level of professionalism as an athlete from the time that he was just a mere boy until just recently, when he finally retired from real shoot fighting and may still take a pro wrestling match every now and then. And at the age of 50, I believe 5 or 6 years old, I've seen him go through guys on the practice mat that were in their 20s and just fucking beat them up and wear them out one right after the other. Russo didn't know what to do with that fucking guy. Even though Ken Shamrock was right across the fucking locker room in another chair, and they could have had that fucking fight and they could have done a lot of shit, he didn't know what to do with him because he's a fucking complete idiot. And so they let me set up Dan's first couple of matches on Raw, where he just basically mauled people and pinned them, as he would do if it was a shoot. And then they started doing a bunch of hokey horse shit and never pushed him and never used him. And by the way, just since people pay this ridiculous 38 cents a week to hear this, but in this case it's free, I did hear that Vince Russo just recently said there was no such thing as a push when they were writing the TV. They didn't push anybody. They just saw who the ratings reflected that people were watching, but they didn't push anybody. This is how big of a fucking dumb fuck that this idiot is, that he was actually writing the television and taking direction from Vince McMahon, whether you like him or not, the most successful promoter of modern day, and he didn't even understand that he was pushing people. You push people, you dumb fuck, you dumb stupid fuck. You push people when they win their matches and they get TV time and they talk and they do promos and they do cool shit that people get into, and they make fools and buffoons of their opponents, and they steamroller over them and they win more of their matches, did I mention? Because that's exactly what happened. Vince McMahon would say, we're going with Austin, and that was a push. That meant that Austin didn't get beat. If he did get beat, he got screwed by another top guy and he came back to get even. That was a push, Russo. That was a push. You don't understand it because you never should have been in this fucking business to begin with, and you didn't even know what you were doing at the time, which was pushing people. They pushed the stars by presenting them as winners and as important and giving them plenty of time to talk on TV and get themselves over. And the people that weren't being pushed lost their matches and didn't talk, and if they did talk, it was to do some of the goddamn bullshit fucking unfunny comedy that you scripted by watching the Jerry Springer show because you have a trailer park trash mentality and you think that everybody out there is just as dumb as the goddamn "he stole my woman" on Jerry Springer because that's the only fucking thing you can understand because of your fucking mentality. So he didn't even know that they were pushing people. They didn't push Dan Severn's why he didn't get over because Dan is not a sparkling personality, but he's real and he's a shoot and they could have made some money with him. He's just not going to go out there and do 20-minute fucking promos and dance around in fucking tutus. And I'll say one more thing while I'm answering that fucking question. Also, I happened to be there, and I don't even know if I've told this story on the show before, but at the time that Mr. Russo was writing the television programming for the biggest wrestling promotion in the world, he also was doing the color commentary for WWF New York. It was a show on Channel 9. It was just for the New York market. And obviously, if you've heard him talk, those are the only people that could fucking understand what he was saying. My wife at the time actually heard one of those shows and listened to it for 2 minutes and said, "I have not yet understood one word that fucking guy said. But he's talking like that because that's the way he's talking, bro, and I'll be honest with you." And as soon as he says, "I'll be honest with you," you know a lie's coming. So we would do the on-cameras at ringside, the announcers would. Like if it wasn't being done live commentary, the announcers would still sit at the desk. You've seen them, me or JR or Michael Cole, or in this case, Russo was down there because of WWF New York, and they would be seen in the background, so you'd think the announcers were there, and every once in a while you'd do it on camera and you'd say something, and they'd put it in, you'd do the commentary later. We've done our bit on the syndicated TVs, and we're walking up the ramp, getting ready for Raw to start, and Russo says, "That was cool." I said, "What are you talking about?" Because it was a pain in my ass to have to go down there and sit there for fucking half an hour, just do one on camera, right? He said, "That was cool." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I've never actually been inside the railing while a match was going on." This motherfucker was allegedly writing the shows for the biggest wrestling promotion in the world, and he had never been inside the railing while a match was going on. This is what some of you people out there think legitimately was the fucking architect of the Attitude Era. He was a hot shotter that threw everything against the fucking wall, and some of it stuck because Vince McMahon knew the right guys to fucking push. Otherwise, he was a fucking idiot.